pile of sheets next to Jake if you don't have one from last week.
Cheat out for you.
So Joe saved the day with the phone during the service, huh?
Yeah, Miriam tapped me on the shoulder. Like, could you fix that? It's a little tall for me.
Because I didn't tie the string tightly enough.
Well, you tied it tight enough to not have your phone slam against the ground again.
Oh, it wasn't going to fall, it was just...
Yeah, I think the string caught it.
Yeah.
But it... Yeah.
I'm hoping that I can get that the Memo working again next week. We'll see. All right, so we were on the worksheet and I'm trying to see if I had a note here about exactly where we were. We looked at Acts. We were talking about the different sections of clean and unclean, the animals that were clean and unclean, and then we talked about the people. We talked about people in the Old Testament, that, God had, the ways that God had kind of sectioned Israel off from other people, and the ways that he hadn't, and what was, and also what the reason was. So remember we talked about these kind of bookends in terms of God's choosing of Israel as his people. It comes right after what and ends at what? When God chooses Abraham and therefore the Israelites to be the special people. What are these bookends to that? Where you have this concept of like many nations and one. So God's focus here in this section is on one nation, the people of Israel. And then there are two bookends to that. The time before he does that, and then the time where that ends.
What ends after Jesus?
Yeah, and particularly what event really, really emphasizes the end? Pentecost does. All these different nations. What is Pentecost an undoing of? It's the other bookend. Tower of Babel. Languages confused. Many languages. They can't understand each other. And then he chooses Abraham, one nation, but one nation because in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That's the original promise to Abraham. So it's this interesting deal where God picks one nation to be special, but he picks them to be special for the purpose of blessing all of them. And Pentecost emphasizes that. Further driving home the point that God was making about, I'm going to turn off my microphone here. Further emphasizing the point that God was making about he's no longer focused on this like one nation thing, like with Israel, is the fact that he destroys the temple. And Jesus, that's why Jesus predicts that so often. And during Holy Week, leading up to his death, Jesus is constantly talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans, his own death, his own resurrection, and the coming of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. Right? And the ways that these things are connected. So we were talking about that. We were using these circles to kind of like help us work through some of this. And I think the next section we want to look at here would be... let's see. I should have put... I always forget to like put a note in my notes like, this is where we stopped last time. And then I can't quite figure it out. We talked about Deuteronomy 18. We talked about Genesis 12. I don't remember if we did Exodus 19. So let's look at that. And if we did, then I will jog my memory. If we didn't, then we will. So Exodus 19, 3 to 6. Jake, you want to read that?
While Moses went up to God, the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel.
Okay, think about what God's doing here, right? Remember, he's laid out, we've seen him laying out these different rules about the priests. So among the people of Israel, he chooses one tribe to be set apart for this certain work on behalf of the rest of the children of Israel, in order to minister before the Lord on behalf of the children of Israel. Here, he says to the whole nation that you are a kingdom of priests out of all the nations of the earth. So look at this. There's this parallelism going on. The Levites, out of all the tribes of Israel, chosen to be a special tribe to be priests. Israel, as a whole, chose to be a special people out of all the peoples of the earth. There's this parallelism. So what do the priests do for the people of Israel? And what do the people of Israel do for the world? Start with the priests. What do the priests do for the people of Israel?
Teach them.
They teach them. In what way? Yes? How? Killing a lot of animals. They go through this service at the temple. They carry out this thing, which the whole thing is a picture of coming Savior, right? Like we've been talking about. What do the people of Israel as a whole do for the world, which is similar? Or I should say, did. They don't do these things anymore.
So that Jesus would be born?
Number one, right? The number one purpose of the people of Israel is give birth to Jesus. Number one. Who is for the world. The priest for the world. But also, they teach the world. See, in the New Testament, this whole, Jesus tells the disciples, go out into all the world. And in Acts, when he's ascending, he says to them, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and Galilee, and to the ends of the earth. We talked about this a while ago when we were doing an Acts Bible study. That's a geographical outline of the book of Acts. Jerusalem, a little bigger, Judea, a little further out, Samaria, a little further out, to the ends of the earth. And that's how the book is organized. It starts by talking about the mission work in Jerusalem, like Peter and John at the temple, and their confrontations with the chief priests, the man that they healed at the temple, etc. Then it talks about how it's going throughout all Judea. Then it talks about the Samaritans. Then it talks about Syria. Then it's Paul going further and further and further out. And the book of Acts ends with Paul talking about how he's going to Rome and how he wants to go to Spain. We never know if he does get to Spain. But he wants to go to Spain, right? Further out. So in the Old Testament, it's different. God never tells his people to go out. He tells them to stay here. But Israel is really uniquely situated. Israel is almost never, in the history of the people of Israel, it's almost never, like, militarily important. There's a couple of short sections. Solomon and David's reign is the main one. Then again under Uzziah, and then again a little bit with Hezekiah. But never as much as David and Solomon. David and Solomon, they're probably the strongest nation in that part of the world. But that's the only time. However, they are always important because they're in the middle of everything. You have to think about where that is. The Mediterranean Sea, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Europe, which they don't know a whole lot about at this point, right? But they're all the barbarians over there, our ancestors, the barbarians. And they're right there in the middle. It's a crossroads, and during the time of the Roman Empire, it's very much a crossroads of the world. Everybody's coming through. This is not an accident. God picks this place to put his people Because that now, after Christ comes, they go out from there all over from this central location. But in the Old Testament, even before they're going out, people are coming in. That's the idea, that the mission model, and there is a mission work model in the Old Testament, but it's different. It isn't going out, it's be a city set on a hill, so that others come in. You know, when Jesus uses that image of a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden, he's using the idea of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a city set on a hill. If you are walking and there's a city with all of its lights up on a hill, you're not going to miss it. So with Jerusalem, so then he also says that about the church. But in the Old Testament, that's the idea. People come to Jerusalem, they come to the temple, they come to Israel. And you see this again at the birth of Christ, because the wise men are representative of this. They're coming to Israel. But then they go back out, and the word starts to spread. So a couple good passages for this. First, let's look at Isaiah 2. Isaiah 2, verses 1 through 4. I was going to die and be dramatic in a good way. Expressive. Isaiah 2, 1 to 4. Amy, back up to slide 3.
The word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.
All right, so notice he's using both ideas. This first idea, the mountain of the Lord's house. Well, that's Mount Zion, right? That's the Temple Mount, where Jerusalem is. It's a mountain. It's not like a huge mountain. It's not like the Rocky Mountains, but it's up on a mountain. And he's saying, everybody's going to flow to it. This is an interesting expression, right? Water does not flow uphill. But he's using that idea, this like counterintuitive thing. And he talks about the latter days. The latter days, when the prophets talk about the latter days, they're talking about the time of Jesus onward. So all the nations are going to come to it. But no longer is he really just talking about Israel itself. Now he's talking about the church. And then some people are going to say, let's go up there that they may teach us. Already in the Old Testament, Israel is meant to be this beacon, teaching the nations when the nations come. But not that many of the nations do come. You have a few stragglers that we see. God puts those stories in there repeatedly to remind us of the focus, but you don't have a whole lot of it. Now it's going out. And Isaiah loves to use David's kingdom as an illustration. So I mentioned before, David and Solomon, that's the one time when Israel, from like a political, military sense, is really strong. He conquers everyone around there. And everyone is bringing him tribute. And everyone has to obey David and Solomon. So Isaiah likes to use these phrases that coastlands will wait for his law. All right? So here in Jerusalem, that's where the law comes from. Here are the coastlands like Tyre and Sidon and Phoenicia and the Philistines, who they just basically completely destroy. They all are going to be under his power. But now Isaiah's saying that's an image of Christ. The word of the Lord. Now, in this translation, it said the law, and then the word. You have this Hebrew parallelism going on because it's poetry. But I've mentioned before, when you see that word law in the Old Testament, I don't know why they persist and insist on doing this, but everybody knows that's not what the Hebrew word means. It doesn't mean law. It means teaching, which includes the law. But it's just the teaching of God, law and gospel. So this teaching of the Lord, this word of the Lord, it goes out. And because it goes out, that's God sending it out through the apostles in the church throughout the world. Now the Gentiles come in. It's talking about Israel now as the church. And the word goes out, and the nations come in because of that word, and they go up to the house of the Lord and they believe, and that includes all of us. All right, so that's what's going on in Acts chapter 2. Let's see, if we're looking at our sheet, our passages, Acts 2 isn't, this one in Acts 2, neither of them are actually listed on there, that's okay. Acts just further brings us, this is the Pentecost text, when Peter's talking about these things, people from every nation under heaven. And if you look at the list, you're like, well, that's not literally every nation under heaven. What it is basically every part of the Roman Empire. And the writer is aware of this, but there's two things going on. First, that was a phrase that the Romans used. It's like they're saying, we're such a great empire. Anything that's not under our sway doesn't really exist at all. Right? It's kind of bragging term. It's a hyperbolic term. But secondly, they're using that to exemplify the fact that the gospel will go, literally, to every nation under heaven. It goes out to the Roman Empire. It goes out beyond the Roman Empire as well, eventually. So that's God's plan for the gospel. We have a few more passages here I wanted to look at. Let's see. Let's go to Leviticus 12. So we had read through Leviticus 11, but not 12 yet. Yeah, they do. They call it, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Like that. That's what Mormons say. Yeah. Latter just means last days, right? And by the way, one really easy thing, because the Mormons will throw that around, like now it's latter days. We were still waiting. What they're saying is that it wasn't really the last days before. Not until Joseph Smith. This last revelation is what they're saying, right? But Hebrews says, now in these last days. The New Testament is really clear. The last days have started from the moment of Jesus coming, really. And especially from Pentecost on. Because now he's given this final revelation. We're not waiting for something else. We're just waiting for him to come again. All right, so Leviticus 12 has all these rules for purification after childbirth. All right? So we're going to look at this because it's going to help with understanding a few of the things that we're talking about as we organize this stuff. Why don't we just read a couple verses at a time, starting with Michael. Just read like 2 verses and then the next person take over.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as at the time of her menstruation she shall be unclean.
And on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary, until the days of her purifying are completed.
But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks during her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days.
And when the days of her purifying are completed, whether for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb a year old for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. And he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female."
Lie? Yeah.
And if she be not able to bring a lamb, then she shall bring 2 turtles or 2 young pigeons, the one for the burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for her, and she shall be clean.
Okay, strike you as weird, Like, why? Like, why make laws about this, right? It seems, okay, imagine you were like a radical feminist, and you read this. How would you react? You'd be like, she's just stigmatizing women. It's just because they hate women. It's just they're making blah, 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 blah. They'd say all this stuff, right? Okay, that's not what's going on. What do you think is going on here? Any ideas? Well, let's look at a couple passages and see. Is it going to help us? These ones are on the list here. So first, Psalm 51:5. If you get there, Hannah, you want to read that? Or, I don't know, looks like Craig doesn't have it. He's got a child.
I can read this book if you like.
Yeah.
Alright, Psalm 51, verse 5. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me.
Okay. One more. Job 14:1-4. Job 14:1-4. Joe, whenever you get there, if you want to read that.
Man who is born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. And do you open your eyes on such a one and bring me into judgment with you? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one.
What does he mean? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean?
A perfect thing of the sinful thing?
What's the unclean thing? What's the sinful thing that he's talking about? Well, yes, in essence, but when he says who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean, he's saying who could bring a clean child out of an unclean mother. And he's not singling out only mothers. His point is what we just read in Psalm 51. I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. He doesn't mean my mom was sinning when she conceived me. He means when I was conceived in sin. From the very moment that I was, well, just one cell, I was a sinner. I was unclean. So these laws here about the birth are meant to be a reminder of original sin. The fact that the mother is a sinner, and the fact that the child is a sinner, and the fact that the father is a sinner. All of it is being represented there. This uncleanness, and that there can be no cleanness. But then notice, see, remember, all this stuff, all this ceremonial laws, they're like a big play. We also had to mention about the part of this that has to do with the men only. What part of Leviticus 12 were we reading? A bunch of it was about women only, but there was something about men only. What was that? Something they only do to circumcision. Circumcision communicates the same thing. The boy is unclean. The cutting away of the flesh is meant, that's part of what the purpose of that is. So God talks in the Old Testament through the prophets, he says, circumcise your hearts, because they're unclean. Cut away the flesh as an image. It's also a reminder, both of these things are. They're a reminder, right? You have childbirth, and you have the male reproductive organ. Okay? What is that a reminder of? Both things are about babies. Both things are about childbirth. The entire Old Testament is about childbirth. All of it. Why do you think there are so many stories about that? And why? And then you go to Revelation 12, and in Revelation 12, well, I think I have this listed there. I don't, but I should. Whatever. Revelation 12 is kind of fascinating because it's picking up this idea. I'll read this section here. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Okay, immediately when we hear this, we should be thinking of Joseph's dream. Because in Joseph's dream, he has two dreams. But one of them, there's the sun and the moon and 11 stars. He's the 12th star. 12 stars for
12 tribes of Israel.
the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. His father and his mother are the sun and the moon. All right, the parallel here is like obvious, right? So you have a woman, She's got the sun and the moon, and under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant, and she was crying out in birth pangs and the agony of giving birth. That's the Old Testament. The Old Testament history begins after creation, after the fall, with God's promise about childbirth, about two things. Two things he tells Eve about childbirth. What are they?
In pain, you're going to conceive a child.
Pain and salvation. Because in your seed, your child, you're going to have pain in giving birth, but it will be through giving birth that the world will be saved. This is why Adam calls Eve, Eve, Chana, living one, because she was the mother of all living. Adam praises Eve more than anything. He thinks the most important thing about Eve is that she gives birth to children. Not because she doesn't think she can do anything else, not even because of the children themselves, but because it is through her giving birth to children, according to God's word and promise, that the Savior will come. And so, over and over and over, this story is repeated in the Old Testament of giving birth, Abram and Sarah. It's why, right in Luke, then, too, we get this, review. Zechariah and Elizabeth are like, we read that story, and we're like, I feel like I've heard this story before. Because we have. And that's why John the Baptist is this bridge, Old Testament, New Testament. And then with Mary, God does something the same, but totally different. And that passage from Job, who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? I know not one. God says, I do. And he does. That's the whole point. So in Mary, remember in Luke, let's look at this last section of passages. First Luke 1:35 and then Luke 2:21. By the way, that section of Revelation goes on. It talks about this woman giving birth and the dragon trying to destroy her child and all these things. But I just wanted to get that image. It's all talking about the Old Testament church giving birth to Christ. That's what the Old Testament church is. The entire period of the Old Testament with all its troubles, those are the birth pangs of Christ. That's what it's being pictured as. So Luke 1:35. Jake, you want to read that?
And the angel answered her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God.
All right, so he's saying, here's how I'm going to bring a clean thing out of an unclean. He's not going to have an earthly father. He's going to be conceived in you, real human flesh, with a real, normal human egg from Mary. But no human father. Yet he's going to be true human. But he won't have the unholiness, the uncleanness. Yet, skip forward, next chapter, Luke 2:21. Amy, you want to read that?
And at the end of 8 days, when he was circumcised, he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb.
And then actually also 22 to 24.
And when the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. And to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves and 2 young pigeons.
So they're keeping what we just read because in the simple act of doing that, Mary is confessing that she is unclean spiritually. And the child is keeping the law because he is born under the law. That's the Galatians passage. He was born under the law, born of a woman, born under the law. Notice when it says born of a woman, it's similar to that Job, man who was born of a woman. It's that Old Testament expression. And yet he keeps the law. He's perfectly holy. Yeah.
So he was circumcised because he was born under the law?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So Jesus, there's two separate things, right? He's born of a woman and he's born under the law. Those things come hand in hand to us as human beings. But they don't necessarily have to be. It is not of the very essence of what it is to be a human, to be under the law. It is of the very essence of what it is to be a sinful human, to be under the law. Notice not above the law, not just having the law, but under the law. That phrase under implies burden. It implies trouble. It implies like an overseer, right? Get back to work. That's the idea. Jesus comes under it to do everything that we haven't done. And the circumcision is the very first thing that shows that, right? Right from when he is born, he's going to do everything, not only of the moral law, but of the ceremonial law. He keeps all the ceremonial law because the ceremonial law is all about him. He's going through all of these things to fulfill it all in our place. Okay, so the clean and unclean thing, we'll get into the back page of this next time and kind of tie this all together. But we have all these passages about things that are unclean, and all these passages about things that are clean, and obviously it's all coming to a head in Jesus. All this imagery from the Old Testament, big play, playing out this prophecy of salvation, and that's the reason for those laws about purification, and they're gone now too. They've fulfilled their purpose. So, any questions? All right, we'll close with the next one. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Oh.